I remember the exact second it happened. Not the minute, not the hour. The second. Because in 400 years of galactic diplomacy, no species had ever done what the humans did on the 11th day of the Peace Summit on Orith Prime. And when it happened, the silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My name is Valith. I serve as Vice Chair of the Galactic Peace Assembly and Senior Diplomat of the Aeluri Confederation. I have spent my career watching species argue, threaten, posture, and bluff across negotiation tables. I have seen wars end and alliances shatter. I thought I understood every move a civilization could make inside a diplomatic chamber. I was wrong. The summit had dragged on for 11 days, 47 species packed into the Grand Assembly Hall, a cavernous dome of polished stone and light panels floating above the neutral station. The dispute was over the Danshai Corridor, a stretch of space containing 14 habitable systems rich in rare minerals. Everyone wanted a piece, everyone had a claim, and the humans, the youngest species at the table, with barely 22 years of council membership, had 3 functioning colonies already established in the corridor. That should have mattered. It did not. The Draethari hegemony controlled the largest voting bloc. Their high speaker, a towering figure named Torhan, had spent every session pushing a resource framework that carved the corridor into pieces and handed the largest shares to the oldest powers. The Valkyrie Trade Syndicate backed him because they always backed whoever promised them profit. Together they had enough votes to pass anything. The humans had objected politely on day 3. They objected again on day 5. By day 8, their ambassador, a woman named Claire Morgan, had formally submitted an amendment requesting equal extraction access for all colonizing species. It was reasonable, it was fair, and it was ignored. On day 11, Claire Morgan stood up during the afternoon session and requested the floor one final time. Torhan granted it with visible impatience, his long fingers drumming the table in a rhythm that every delegate recognized as contempt. She spoke calmly. She laid out the amendment again, with updated data showing that human colonies had contributed more survey information about the corridor than any other 3 species combined. She noted that human relay stations provided communication infrastructure across 7 of the 14 systems. She asked, simply, for her people to be treated as equals. Torhan leaned forward and said something I will never forget. He said, "Ambassador Morgan, the corridor framework reflects the contributions and standing of established civilizations. Your species has been walking among the stars for barely a generation. Perhaps when you have earned your place, your requests will carry weight." Several delegates laughed. Not all of them, but enough. The Valkyrie representative chuckled. The Bryn Combine delegate smiled. Even a few of the minor species joined in. The nervous laughter of those who wanted to stay on the winning side. Claire Morgan did not react. She did not raise her voice. She did not slam her hand on the table or threaten consequences. She simply looked around the chamber, slowly, meeting the eyes of every delegate who had laughed. Then she nodded once, turned to her delegation, and said 3 words. "We are done." The human delegation rose, all 9 of them, moving in unison as though they had rehearsed this moment. They closed their data folders. They powered down their translation devices. They unplugged their links from the shared summit network. One by one, the small blue indicators on the human console went dark. Claire Morgan walked to the door without looking back. Her team followed. Their footsteps echoed in the sudden quiet, a slow, measured rhythm that sounded nothing like retreat. It sounded like a decision. The door closed behind them. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that chamber moved. I remember counting, 1, 2, 3. Then Torhan broke the silence with a low, rumbling laugh and said, "Well, that simplifies things." The tension dissolved. Delegates shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that ranged from amusement to mild surprise. The Valkyrie representative called for an immediate vote on the original framework. Without the humans to object, it passed unanimously in under an hour. The corridor was divided. Human-claimed zones were redistributed among the major powers. It was clean, fast, and efficient. I voted with the majority. I want that on the record. When the moment came to speak up, to ask whether perhaps we should pause and consider what had just happened, I stayed silent. I told myself it was pragmatic. The humans were a minor species. Their departure was dramatic, but ultimately insignificant. The galaxy had functioned for millennia without them. It would continue to do so. That evening, I returned to my quarters aboard the station and reviewed the session transcript. I read Claire Morgan's final remarks 3 times. What struck me was not her words, it was her tone. The translation software assigned it a classification I had never seen applied to a diplomatic address before. It labeled her delivery as resolved. Not angry, not bitter, not threatening. Resolved. I had seen species storm out of negotiations before. The Tessari did it regularly, slamming doors and issuing ultimatums that everyone knew they would retract within a day. The Bryn Combine once boycotted an entire summit season over a seating arrangement dispute. These were performances. Everyone understood the script. You leave, you make noise, you come back when you have extracted a concession. But the humans had not made noise. They had not issued an ultimatum. They had not threatened to return with warships or economic sanctions. They had simply left, quietly, completely. And that difference gnawed at something deep in my diplomatic instincts, something I could not name but could not ignore. I pulled up the Council's contact registry and looked for the human diplomatic frequency. It was offline. Not busy, not redirected. Offline. Their entire communication suite on Orith Prime had been deactivated. I checked the docking records. The human transport vessel had departed the station 40 minutes after the walkout. It was already beyond scanner range, heading toward the nearest human-controlled relay point at full speed. I told myself this was posturing, a dramatic exit to set the stage for a dramatic return. They would send a message within days, expressing willingness to renegotiate if certain conditions were met. Every species did this. It was the oldest move in the diplomatic manual. I poured myself a drink and tried to sleep. But lying in the dark, I kept returning to one detail that would not release me. When Claire Morgan had looked around the chamber at the delegates who had laughed, her expression had not been one of fury or wounded pride. It had been the expression of someone confirming something they already knew. She had been checking, one final time, whether anyone in that room would stand up for her people. And when no one did, she had not been surprised. That was the part that frightened me. The humans had expected us to fail them. They had walked into that session prepared for exactly what happened. The folders they closed so neatly had never been unpacked, because they knew they would not need them. The data they had compiled, the amendment they had submitted, all of it was not a genuine attempt to change the outcome. It was a test, a final, measured test of whether the Galactic Council valued humanity enough to grant them basic fairness. We failed, and they had a plan for that. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my terminal and did something I should have done years earlier. I opened the Council's shared infrastructure database and searched for every system, service, and supply chain that carried a human contribution tag. The results loaded slowly, page after page, scrolling past my screen in a cascade of data points that made my chest tighten. Relay stations, navigation algorithms, medical patents, agricultural biotechnology, emergency response protocols, freight scheduling systems, peacekeeping patrol routes, disaster relief frameworks, educational exchange programs, deep space hazard mapping. The list went on for over 200 entries. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. In 22 years of Council membership, humanity had quietly embedded itself into the operational foundation of galactic civilization, not through conquest, not through political maneuvering, through generosity. They had given freely, contributed voluntarily, and never once demanded recognition or compensation for any of it. And we had just laughed at them when they asked to be treated as equals. I closed the database and looked out the viewport at the stars. Somewhere out there, a human ship was carrying 9 diplomats home. They were not coming back. I was certain of that now, with a clarity that settled into my bones like cold water. I should have spoken. I should have stood up in that chamber and asked the one question no one was asking. Why were they not angry? Why had Claire Morgan walked out with the calm of someone who had already mourned this outcome, processed it, and moved on? Because anger meant she still cared. Anger meant there was something left to negotiate with. But that quiet nod, that measured walk to the door, those 3 simple words spoken without tremor or hesitation, those were not the actions of someone who wanted to come back. Those were the actions of someone who had already let go. And a species that has let go of you is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. Not because of what they might do to you, but because of what they will stop doing for you. I did not understand that yet. Not fully, but I felt it. The way you feel a storm before you see it. A pressure in the air. A wrongness in the wind. The storm was coming. I just did not know how bad it would be. The first 7 days after the humans left were the easiest days the Galactic Council had experienced in years. I say that without exaggeration. The remaining 46 species moved through the summit agenda with a speed and harmony that felt almost unnatural. Disputes that had festered for months were resolved in single sessions. Trade agreements that had stalled over minor clauses were finalized with handshakes and polite nods. The Draethari were visibly pleased. Torhan walked the corridors of Orith Prime like a conqueror, accepting congratulations from delegates who praised his decisive leadership. The humans were a disruption, he told me during a reception on the 4th day. Young species always are. They demand things they have not earned, and they slow the progress of those who have. The council is better without their noise. I nodded and said nothing, but I kept watching the infrastructure database. Every morning, I checked for changes. For the first week, there were none. Every human system, every relay station, every shared service remained operational. Life went on. By the 10th day, I had almost convinced myself that my fears were unfounded. The humans had walked out, but their infrastructure was still running. Perhaps they had simply abandoned their political ambitions while maintaining their commercial obligations. It was a rational interpretation. It made me feel better. On day 12, the first relay station went dark. It was a small one, a communication hub designated HR7 that serviced 3 systems in the Eastern Corridor. The station's automated systems sent a standard notification to all connected networks. It read, Human Relay Station, HR7, entering scheduled maintenance cycle. Estimated duration, indefinite. Alternative routing recommended. I flagged it immediately and sent a query to the Council's Infrastructure Division. They told me it was routine. Relay stations go offline for maintenance regularly. There was nothing unusual about it. On day 15, 2 more relays went dark. Same message, scheduled maintenance, indefinite duration. On day 19, another 3. By day 25, 9 of the 14 human relay stations in the Dana U corridor had been deactivated. Communication across 7 systems dropped from instant FTL transmission to sublight backup channels. Messages that used to arrive in seconds now took hours. In some cases, days. I requested an emergency briefing with the Council's technical committee. They were annoyed by my insistence, but agreed to review the situation. Their conclusion was calm and bureaucratic. The human stations were privately owned assets. The humans were within their legal rights to deactivate them at any time. The Council would simply need to invest in replacement infrastructure. I asked how long that would take. The committee chair, a Vale Curry engineer, reviewed the specifications and went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, The human relay technology uses a quantum entanglement protocol that we have not been able to replicate. Building equivalent stations from our own designs would take 15 to 20 years. 15 to 20 years, and we were already losing communication across 7 systems. I brought this to Torhan directly. He dismissed it with a wave of his massive hand. We survived for millennia without human relays. We will adapt. But adaptation was already proving difficult in ways nobody had anticipated. On day 28, the Vale Curry Trade Syndicate reported a logistics problem. Human commercial freighters, which had been carrying roughly 18% of all cargo in the corridor, had stopped operating. Not because of any official order or embargo. Their contracts had simply expired, and the human shipping companies had declined to renew them. Politely, without explanation. The Vale Curry scrambled to fill the gap with their own vessels, but they did not have enough. No one had enough. Human freighters were fast, reliable, and cheap, because they used the same navigation algorithms that the humans had open-sourced to the Council 5 years earlier. Those algorithms calculated the most efficient routes through dense nebula corridors, avoiding hazards that other navigation systems could not even detect. On day 31, the algorithms disappeared from the public repository. A brief notice replaced them. This resource has been archived by its creators. It is no longer available for public use. Shipping costs in the corridor doubled within a week. 3 Vale Curry trading houses reported losses that they described as severe. I began making calls. Quiet ones, through private channels, to delegates I trusted. I wanted to know if anyone else was noticing what I was noticing. The answer was yes, but nobody wanted to talk about it publicly. The Drathari block was still powerful, and questioning the wisdom of letting the humans leave was the same as questioning Torhan, which no one was willing to do. On day 35, a Movarathi delegate, named Selen, approached me in the corridor outside the assembly chamber. The Movarathi were a neutral species, amphibian in biology, gentle in temperament. They had voted with the majority on the corridor framework, but had done so reluctantly. Selen looked distressed, his normally smooth skin rippling with the color patterns that his species displayed under stress. He told me about the enzyme stabilizer. It was a compound used in cryomedicine, the technology that allowed long-duration space travel in suspended animation. Nearly every species in the Council used cryosystems for deep space journeys. The enzyme stabilizer prevented cellular degradation during the freezing process. Without it, cryosleep carried a 30% risk of irreversible tissue damage. The stabilizer was manufactured almost exclusively by human biolaboratories on Earth and their colony worlds. No other species had developed the biological engineering capability to produce it at scale. Current reserves across the galaxy would last approximately 90 days. 90 days. And then every species that relied on cryotravel would face a choice between risking the lives of their passengers or grounding their long-range fleets entirely. Did we know this? Selen asked me, his voice barely above a whisper. Did anyone check how much we depended on them before we pushed them away? I did not answer, because the answer was obvious. No one had checked, no one had thought to check. The humans had been so quiet in their contributions, so consistent and undemanding, that their support had become invisible. Like the air in a sealed habitat, you never thought about it until it was gone, and by then, you were already choking. On day 37, Torhan drafted a formal communication to the human government. It was not a request, it was a demand. The document cited existing infrastructure sharing treaties, signed during the humans' provisional membership, and required the immediate restoration of all relay stations, the renewal of all freight contracts, and the continued supply of the enzyme stabilizer at pre-withdrawal prices. The human government's reply arrived 2 days later. It was one sentence long. Humanity is no longer a signatory to the Oreth Accords. We wish you well. I read that sentence 14 times. Each time, it hit differently. The first few readings, I focused on the legal precision. They were right. By walking out of the summit and formally withdrawing from the Council, they had dissolved their obligations under every treaty tied to Council membership. Every relay station, every algorithm, every medical compound they had shared was a voluntary contribution made under a framework they were no longer part of. We had no legal claim to any of it. But it was the last 3 words that stayed with me. We wish you well. Not a threat, not a warning, a farewell. The kind of thing you say to someone you do not expect to speak to again. I called an emergency session of the assembly. Torhan resisted, but enough minor species supported the motion to force it through. I stood before the chamber and presented my findings. The relay shutdowns, the freight withdrawals, the enzyme crisis, the navigation algorithms. I laid it all out, point by point, and watched the faces of the delegates change as the scale of our dependency became clear. 40 days. That was all it had taken. 40 days of quiet withdrawal, and the cracks were already spreading through the foundation of galactic commerce and communication. When I finished, the chamber was silent. Not the contemplative silence of leaders considering their options. The stunned silence of people realizing they had made a terrible mistake. Torhan broke it, as he always did. These are inconveniences, he said, his deep voice filling the chamber. Not crises. We are the Galactic Council. We have resources and ingenuity far beyond what one minor species can provide. We will build our own relays. We will synthesize our own stabilizers. We will chart our own routes. We do not chase after those who abandon the table. He received applause. Not as much as before, but enough. I sat down and opened the dependency audit on my personal screen. The number at the top of the report stared back at me. 63. 63 critical supply lines in the corridor alone carried a human contribution tag. Not minor ones, critical. The kind that, if removed, would cause cascading failures across multiple systems and multiple species. We had just told the people holding 63 pillars of our civilization that they did not matter. And they had believed us. That was the cruelest part. We did not just insult them, we convinced them. We looked at a species that had spent 22 years giving everything it had to a community that treated it as lesser, and we told them, clearly and publicly, that their contributions were worthless. And they took us at our word. I closed the database and sat in the darkened chamber long after the other delegates had left. Somewhere, light years away, the humans were going about their lives, building things, solving problems, helping each other, doing all the things they used to do for us. I pulled up the transcript from day 11 and read Claire Morgan's final words one more time. We are done. 3 words. Clean and final, like the closing of a book that would never be opened again. I should have stood up, I should have spoken. I should have been the voice in that room that said wait. But I had been afraid of Torhan, afraid of the Drathari block, afraid of being wrong. Now I was afraid of something much worse. I was afraid of being right. My people have a saying. You do not notice the creature holding up the sky until it sets the sky down. I grew up hearing it. I never understood what it meant. Not until day 74, when the sky began to fall, and I could not find anyone strong enough to catch it. The collapse did not happen all at once. It was not a dramatic explosion or a sudden catastrophe. It was a slow unraveling, thread by thread, system by system, until the fabric of galactic cooperation that we had all taken for granted started coming apart in our hands. The communication breakdown came first and hit the hardest. With 11 of the 14 human relay stations now offline, entire sections of the corridor operated on sublight communication only. Military patrols could not coordinate. Trade convoys could not confirm delivery schedules. Medical facilities on remote colonies could not consult specialists on central worlds. A Valkyrie transport ship carrying industrial equipment to a mining colony in the 7th system missed a critical course correction because the hazard data it needed was stuck in a sublight transmission queue. The ship flew directly into an uncharted asteroid field. It survived, barely, but the cargo was destroyed. The mining colony went without essential machinery for 3 months. These were not abstract problems. These were lives disrupted, economies strained, and systems failing in real time. And every failure traced back to the same root cause. Something the humans had built, maintained, or provided was no longer there. The navigation crisis deepened rapidly once the open-source algorithms were pulled. I had underestimated how deeply those algorithms were integrated into standard shipping practices. It was not just the corridor. Human navigation code had been adopted by freighter companies across 12 sectors because it was simply better than anything else available. It detected gravitational anomalies that other systems missed. It calculated fuel-efficient routes through regions that most pilots avoided entirely. It had saved thousands of ships from hazards they never even knew were there. Without it, shipping companies fell back on older navigation systems. Accident rates in dense nebula corridors increased by 40% within 60 days. Insurance costs for freight operations tripled. 3 Valkyrie trading houses that had been reporting record profits during the summit now filed for emergency financial protection. But the economic damage was only part of the story. The human enzyme stabilizer shortage reached critical levels faster than anyone had projected. Selen, the Mvarathi delegate, came to me on day 80 with a report from his government. 2 Mvarathi agricultural colonies in the outer corridor depended entirely on human-engineered soil bacteria for their crop production. The bacteria had been a gift from humanity, developed and provided free of charge during a Mavarathi famine 12 years earlier. Without regular culture replenishment from human biolabs, the bacterial colonies in the soil were degrading. Crop yields had dropped 30% and were still falling. I read Sellen's report in my quarters that night and felt something cold settle in my stomach. 12 years ago, the Mvarathi had faced starvation on 2 colony worlds. They had sent distress calls to every species in the council. The Drathari had offered a trade agreement with unfavorable terms. The Veilkuri had offered loans at steep interest. The humans, a species that had been in the council for barely a decade at that point, had shown up with a fleet of agricultural ships, spent 4 months engineering a soil bacterium specifically adapted to Mavarathi colony conditions, and handed over the technology with a handshake and a smile. No payment, no trade concessions, no political demands, just help. And now that help was disappearing because we had laughed at them when they asked for equal mining rights. I was appointed to lead the Human Re-Engagement Committee on day 85. It was a grand title for a desperate task. The committee had 7 members, most of them minor species delegates, who had been too afraid to vote against the corridor framework, but were now too afraid not to try fixing what it had broken. The Drathari refused to participate. Torhan called the committee an exercise in weakness and publicly stated that the council should focus on self-sufficiency rather than begging a departed species to return. Self-sufficiency. I wanted to scream when he said that. Self-sufficiency from a species that had been quietly holding our civilization together for 22 years while we treated them as guests who had overstayed their welcome. My first act as committee chair was to conduct a full audit of humanity's contributions to the council. I assigned 2 analysts to the task. They came back 3 days later looking pale. The audit revealed a pattern so consistent it was almost painful to read. In their 22 years of membership, humans had contributed to the council in ways that no other species ever had. Not because they were required to, because they chose to. They built relay stations and offered them to the shared network for free. They developed medical technologies and released the patents to the public domain. They sent peacekeeping ships to conflict zones where they had no strategic interest. They funded educational exchange programs for species that could not afford them. They created disaster response protocols that became the galactic standard. And the most remarkable thing about all of it was how little attention they had drawn to themselves. Most council delegates could not have named a single human contribution if asked. The relay stations were just there. The medical patents were just available. The peacekeeping ships just showed up when needed. Humanity had made itself indispensable without ever making itself visible, and that invisibility had been their downfall. We could not value what we could not see. The audit counted over 200 distinct contributions across military, economic, scientific, medical, and humanitarian categories. The estimated cost of replacing them, if replacement was even technically possible, exceeded the combined annual budgets of the 12 wealthiest council species. I presented these findings to the full assembly on day 92. The response was divided. The minor species were alarmed. The Mavarathi, the Tessari, and several others demanded immediate action. But the Drathari bloc held firm. Torhan acknowledged the data but insisted that it demonstrated dependency, not value. A species that allows itself to become dependent on another has already lost its sovereignty, he declared. We will invest in our own capabilities. We will not go crawling to the humans. He received less applause this time, but he still controlled enough votes to block any formal outreach to humanity. Meanwhile, the outer verge was burning. For 6 years, human patrol ships had been quietly mediating a territorial dispute between the Tessari Dominion and the Bryn Combine in 3 contested systems along the galactic rim. The dispute was ancient, rooted in competing colonial claims that predated council membership for both species. Human captains had established a buffer zone, conducted joint patrols with both sides, and maintained a fragile peace through persistent, patient diplomacy. When the humans withdrew, those patrols stopped. The buffer zone was unmonitored, and within 30 days, the Tessari and the Bryn Combine were shooting at each other again. The first engagement was small. A Tessari corvette fired on a Bryn supply vessel that it claimed was trespassing. The Bryn retaliated by destroying a Tasari sensor outpost. Within a week, both sides had mobilized battle groups. Within 2 weeks, 3 orbital stations had been destroyed, and an estimated 4,000 people of both species were dead. The Council issued a ceasefire resolution. Both the Tasari and the Bryn ignored it. Without enforcement capability, without ships in the region, without the quiet diplomatic pressure that human commanders had been applying for years, the resolution was nothing but words on a screen. I watched the casualty reports come in each morning and felt a particular kind of sickness. Not the shock of unexpected tragedy. The guilty recognition that this had been entirely predictable. Everyone on the Council knew the Tasari-Bryn dispute was volatile. Everyone knew that human patrols were the only thing keeping it contained, and no one had thought about what would happen when those patrols disappeared, because no one had thought about the humans at all. On day 105, I went to Torhan's quarters personally. I brought the full audit, the casualty reports from the Outer Verge, the crop failure projections from the Mvarathi colonies, the shipping accident statistics, and the enzyme stabilizer inventory countdown. I spread them across his desk and stood there while he read them. He took his time. I will give him that. He read every page, every chart, every projection. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at me and said, "I understand the severity, but the Draethari do not bow to lesser species. We will find our own solutions." I lost my composure then. For the first time in my career, I raised my voice to a head of state. "They are not a lesser species," I said. "They built the communication backbone of your empire. They provided the medicine your soldiers use in cryotransit. They kept 2 species from destroying each other for 6 years while you collected the credit. And you called them, to their faces, a species that had not earned its place." Torhan stared at me. In Draethari culture, raising your voice to a superior is a profound breach of protocol. Advisors have been exiled for less. But I did not care anymore. I was watching the galaxy crack, and the man who had broken it was sitting in front of me talking about pride. "You called them primates," I said, quieter now. "They built the technology that lets you speak to your own colonies in real time, and you called them primates." Torhan said nothing. He looked at the reports on his desk, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that might have been doubt. But doubt and action are different things, and Torhan was not a creature of action when action meant admitting he was wrong. I left his quarters and walked to the observation deck. The stars were bright and cold, scattered across the viewport like fragments of something that had once been whole. Somewhere out there, human colonies were thriving. Human ships were trading with each other. Human scientists were developing new technologies that they would never share with us. An entire civilization was carrying on without us, perfectly functional, perfectly content, perfectly indifferent to the chaos they had left behind. That indifference was the knife that cut deepest. I had spent months telling myself that the humans were punishing us, that this was a calculated strategy of pressure, designed to force concessions, that eventually they would make contact and present their demands, and we would negotiate, and things would return to some version of normal. But the more I studied their withdrawal, the more I realized it was not a strategy at all. It was a farewell. They had not cut off the relay stations to pressure us into giving them mining rights. They had cut them off because those stations belonged to them, and they no longer saw any reason to share. They had not pulled the navigation algorithms to crash our shipping industry. They had pulled them because they had created those algorithms for a community they were no longer part of. This was not leverage. This was a civilization collecting its things and walking away. And that was so much worse than any threat could have been, because you cannot negotiate with someone who has already left the room and locked the door behind them. I sent a message to Claire Morgan that night through the only remaining open channel, a civilian emergency frequency that the humans had not deactivated. I kept it short. I told her I was sorry. I told her I wanted to talk. I asked if she would consider a private conversation, off the record, no council oversight. I did not expect a reply. I got one 12 hours later. It said, "I will speak with you, counselor, but not on your terms, on mine." I agreed immediately. That conversation would change everything. The call came through on a frequency I did not recognize. routed through 3 independent relay points outside Council jurisdiction. Claire Morgan was taking no chances. Even a private conversation with a Council official carried risks she was not willing to accept without precautions. When her voice came through my speaker, I was struck by how ordinary it sounded. I had spent months building her into something larger than life in my mind, the architect of the galaxy's unraveling, the woman who had walked out of a 400-year institution and shaken it to its core. But her voice was simply human, calm, clear, and tired. "Counselor Valeth," she said, "thank you for reaching out." "Ambassador Morgan," I replied, "thank you for responding." "I am not an ambassador anymore," she said. "I resigned my diplomatic credentials when our withdrawal was ratified. Call me Claire." That small correction told me more than any intelligence briefing could have. She was no longer a diplomat. She held no official position, and yet she had agreed to speak with me. That meant either she still cared enough to try, or she wanted me to understand something that I had not yet grasped. I began with what I had prepared. I laid out the situation as clearly as I could. The relay shutdowns, the shipping crisis, the enzyme shortage, the war in the outer verge. I presented numbers and projections. I was thorough, precise, and honest about the severity of every problem. Claire listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said something I had not expected. "I know." "You know?" "We track galactic news, Valeth. We know about the outer verge. We know about the Mavarathi crops. We know about the shipping accidents. We know about all of it." "And you have done nothing," I said, and immediately regretted the accusation in my tone. But Claire did not react with anger. She responded with a question. "When one of your analysts gets fired from their job unfairly, do you expect them to keep coming to the office and doing the work for free?" I opened my mouth to respond, and realized I had no answer. Because the analogy was precise and devastating. "We did not leave to punish you," Claire continued. Her voice was steady, without malice, without triumph. "I need you to understand that. This is not revenge. This is not a bargaining tactic. We left because staying was destroying us." "Destroying you how?" I asked. 22 years, she said. 22 years of provisional membership. 22 years of contributing everything we could think of, everything we could build, everything we could give, in the hope that someday the Council would look at us and see equals. We built your relay network. We developed your cryomedicine. We patrolled your borders. We fed your allies. We gave away technology that we could have sold for enough to fund our expansion for a century. And we did it because we believed in the idea of the Council. We believed that a community of species working together was worth more than any individual advantage. She paused. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Not harder, but deeper. Like she was speaking from a place she usually kept closed. "Do you know what it does to a civilization when it spends 22 years giving everything it has and getting nothing back? Not nothing material. We never asked for payment. Nothing in terms of respect. Nothing in terms of recognition. Nothing in terms of basic dignity. My people watched that summit, Valeth. Every human on every colony world watched the live feed of Day 11. They watched a room full of species that we had bled for, that we had built infrastructure for, that we had sent our sons and daughters to protect. They watched that room laugh when we asked to be treated fairly." I closed my eyes. I remembered the laughter. I remembered my own silence. "Do you know what that does to a civilization's willingness to keep giving?" Claire asked. I did not answer. Because the answer was obvious, and it was sitting in front of me, in the form of dark relay stations, and empty shipping lanes, and dying crops on Mavarathi colony worlds. "We held a referendum," Claire said. "After the walkout, our government presented the question to every human citizen of voting age, across all our worlds. The question was simple. Should humanity remain a member of the Galactic Council? 81% voted to permanently withdraw. 81%. The number landed in my chest like a physical blow. "You are not negotiating with a diplomat, counselor," Claire said quietly. "You are not even negotiating with a government. You are negotiating with a democracy that remembers being humiliated. Every teacher, every farmer, every engineer, every soldier who watched that summit, they all had a vote. And 81% of them decided that the Galactic Council was not worth their kindness anymore. I sat in silence for a long time after she said that. The weight of it pressed down on me from every direction. This was not a political calculation that could be reversed by offering better terms or making back-channel deals. This was personal. It was millions of individual human beings, each one making a private decision that the galaxy had treated them badly enough for long enough that they were done trying. What would it take, I finally asked, to bring you back? Claire was quiet for so long that I thought the connection had dropped. Then she said, I do not know if it is possible, Valith. I am being honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty. The people who voted to leave are not angry. They are not vindictive. They are tired. They are tired of being generous to a galaxy that treats generosity as weakness. And tired people do not come back because someone asks nicely. They come back because they see evidence that something has changed. Tell me what evidence they would need. Full membership, she said without hesitation. Not provisional. Full. Permanent, with complete voting rights on all council matters, retroactive recognition of our colonial claims in the Danai Corridor, including mining rights equal to any other species, a formal apology, not from a committee, not from a spokesperson, ratified by all 47 remaining species and delivered publicly. I was already calculating which of these demands the council might accept when she added the last condition. And the apology must be delivered by High Speaker Torhan. Personally, I nearly laughed, not from amusement but from the sheer impossibility of it. Torhan, the leader of the Draythari hegemony, the most powerful individual in the galactic political structure, publicly apologizing to the species he had dismissed as unworthy of a seat at the table. It was unthinkable. The Draythari did not apologize. It was not merely a political stance. It was a cultural absolute. In their history, a public apology from a leader was equivalent to a formal surrender. Claire, I said carefully, you understand what you are asking. I understand exactly what I am asking, she replied. And that is why I am asking it. We are not negotiating for resources, Valith. We have resources. We are negotiating for respect. And respect is meaningless if it comes from people who find it easy to give. It has to cost something. It has to come from the person who insulted us, standing in front of the galaxy, admitting that he was wrong. It may be impossible. Then we do not come back, she said simply. And I want to be clear about something. We will be fine. We have our own worlds, our own technology, our own trade networks. We have been building alternatives since the moment we walked out. In a year, we will be completely self-sufficient. In 5 years, we will be thriving. The question is not whether humanity can survive without the Council. The question is whether the Council can survive without humanity, and I think you already know the answer to that. I did know. I had known since the night I first opened the dependency audit and counted 63 critical supply lines with human fingerprints on them. But knowing and accepting are different things, and accepting meant going back to a council chamber full of proud, ancient species and telling them that their survival depended on swallowing their pride and begging a 22-year-old member to come back. I will try, I said. I believe you, Claire replied. And Valith, for what it is worth, I am sorry that it came to this. We did not want to leave. We wanted to belong. But belonging requires being wanted, and we were never wanted. And there is a difference between tolerance and acceptance that your council never learned. The call ended. I sat alone in my quarters and stared at the wall. 81%. That number echoed in my mind like a drumbeat, because it meant this was not a political decision. It was not a strategic maneuver. It was personal. Every human, on every world, in every home and workplace and school, had looked at what we did and decided, together, individually and collectively, that we were not worth their kindness anymore. I had spent my career believing that diplomacy was about finding the middle ground between competing interests. But this was not a negotiation between interests. This was a judgment. Humanity had judged the Galactic Council and found it wanting, and the verdict had been delivered not by generals or politicians, but by teachers and farmers and engineers, Ordinary people who had once believed in the idea of a galactic community and had been told, to their faces, that they were not good enough to be part of it. I returned to the assembly the next day and delivered my report. I held nothing back. I shared the terms Claire had laid out, including the final condition about Torhan. The chamber erupted. The Draythari delegation stormed out. Several species accused me of manufacturing a crisis to advance my own political position. Torhan himself issued a public statement calling my report the desperate fantasy of a diplomat who has lost her nerve. But the numbers were on my side. The cryoenzyme reserves would run out in 45 days. The Outer Verge conflict had spread to a fourth system. 2 more Mavorathi colony worlds were reporting crop failures. The Valkyrie economy was in free fall, and every single one of these crises had the same solution. A solution that required one person to do one thing that he had spent his entire life believing he was above doing. I looked at the chaos in the assembly chamber and made a decision. I would not wait for the council to act. I would force them to act. Because the humans had taught me something in their 22 years of quiet service that I had been too blind to see. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not stand your ground. Sometimes, the bravest thing is to be the first one to bend. The coalition I built over the next 30 days was the most fragile political structure I had ever assembled. But it held. It held because every species in it knew, even if they would not say it publicly, that the alternative to bending was breaking. And the galaxy could not afford to break. The council fractured on day 198, and when it did, the sound was not dramatic. It was quiet, the way truly important things always are. The Mvorathi were the first to move. Selen stood before the assembly and delivered a formal censure of the Draythari hegemony for provoking the human withdrawal. His voice trembled, but his words were precise. He named the laughter. He named the dismissal. He named the 22 years of human generosity that the council had treated as background noise. And he named the consequences that were now measured in dead soldiers in the Outer Verge and starving colonies in the corridor. 6 other species joined the censure within the hour. The Tisari, despite being engaged in their own conflict, submitted a statement acknowledging that human peacekeepers had been the only reason their dispute with the Bryn Combine had remained contained for 6 years. 2 Valkyrie trading houses, acting independently of their government, publicly broke with the syndicate and demanded human re-engagement. The political math shifted overnight. Torhan's bloc, which had seemed unshakable for decades, lost 14 votes in a single session. The Valkyrie syndicate, facing economic ruin if the shipping and cryomedicine crises were not resolved, withdrew their support entirely. For the first time in living memory, the Draythari hegemony stood alone in the assembly chamber. Torhan resigned as High Speaker on day 204. He did not announce it publicly. He sent a brief message to the assembly chair and left the station without addressing the delegates. I heard later that his own advisory council had forced the decision, arguing that his continued presence was preventing the re-engagement that every species now recognized as essential. The assembly elected me as acting chair of the re-engagement initiative. The title was ceremonial. The responsibility was crushing. I had one task: bring the humans back. And I had one obstacle, the last condition that Claire Morgan had set. The apology. Torhan's apology. Torhan was no longer High Speaker, but he was still the leader of the Draythari hegemony. He was still the person who had spoken the words that drove the humans away. And the humans had been very specific. The apology had to come from him. I spent 3 weeks trying to find an alternative. I proposed having the new Draythari delegation head deliver the apology. Claire's response, relayed through our Muvarathi intermediary, was one word: no. I suggested a joint apology from all 47 species. Again, no. I even floated the idea of a written statement from Torhan, submitted to the human government without a public ceremony. The response was the same. The apology must be personal, public, and from the individual who spoke the words. Anything less tells our people that the galaxy is still too proud to treat them as equals. I understood the logic even as I resented the difficulty. The humans were not being petty, they were being precise. The humiliation had been personal and public. The repair had to match. A written apology from a resigned official, delivered behind closed doors, would tell every human citizen that the galaxy was still trying to save face rather than genuinely change. And a galaxy that was still trying to save face was a galaxy that would repeat the same mistake the moment it felt secure again. I traveled to the Draythari homeworld on day 230. It was the first time an Aeluri diplomat had visited the Draythari capital in over a century. The planet was beautiful in its severity. Vast plains of dark stone, cities built like fortresses, skies the color of iron. A world that had produced a civilization of warriors and conquerors, proud to the point of self-destruction. Torhan received me in his private residence, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the capital. He looked diminished without the trappings of his office, older and quieter than the commanding figure who had dominated the assembly chamber for 30 years. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I showed him the latest reports. The enzyme reserves had run out 2 weeks earlier. Cryo travel across 9 species had been suspended. The Outer Verge War had claimed 22,000 lives. The Valkyrie economy had contracted by 30%, and the first long-range communication blackout, lasting 11 days, had just ended in the 7th corridor system after emergency teams rerouted traffic through outdated Tassari relay equipment that failed twice under the load. "This is what your pride has cost," I told him. "Not human pride, yours, personally." Torhan looked at the reports for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "You are asking me to do something that no Draythari leader has done in our recorded history. A public apology is a surrender in our culture. You know this." "I know this," I said, "and the humans know this. That is why they are asking for it, because they need to see that the galaxy values them more than the galaxy values its own comfort. And if I refuse? Then the galaxy continues to collapse. Not today, not tomorrow, but steadily, irreversibly, until the systems that humanity built for us fail completely, and we are left trying to rebuild from scratch what they gave us for free. 15 years for the relays, 20 for the navigation systems. We may never replicate the enzyme stabilizer, and in the meantime, the outer verge burns, the corridor starves, and every species in the Council remembers that the Draythari hegemony chose pride over survival. He stared at me with those deep dark eyes that had intimidated diplomats for decades, but I was past intimidation. I had watched a galaxy come apart because powerful people could not bring themselves to say the words, "I am sorry." "There is something else you should know," I said. "I visited the human homeworld." His expression shifted slightly. Curiosity, perhaps, beneath the stone. "I went to Earth," I continued. "I wanted to understand the species we had dismissed. I walked their cities. I visited their universities, and their farms and their hospitals. Do you know what I found?" He waited. "Chaos," I said. "Beautiful, roaring, magnificent chaos. Their cities are loud and messy, and alive in a way I have never experienced. Their people argue with each other constantly. They disagree about everything. They build things and tear them down, and build them again, differently, better. They are not organized like us. They are not disciplined like your people. They are wild and unpredictable, and stubborn, and endlessly, relentlessly creative." I leaned forward. "And they are kind, Torhan. Underneath all the noise and the chaos, they are extraordinarily kind. They helped the Mvorathi because the Mvorathi were hungry. They built relay stations because other species needed communication. They patrolled the outer verge because people were dying and they could not stand by and watch. Not because they were ordered to. Not because they expected payment, because it was the right thing to do." I paused. We laughed at them for that. We took their kindness and called it weakness. And now that kindness is gone, and we are discovering what it feels like to live in a galaxy without it. The room was silent for a long time. I could hear the wind outside, harsh and steady across the dark Draythari plains. "The apology," Torhan said finally. "What exactly must I say?" I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief. Not yet. But the first faint suggestion that relief might eventually be possible. We spent the next 4 days drafting the statement. Torhan fought over every word, not to weaken it, but to make sure it was genuine. I had expected resistance and resentment. What I got instead, was something I had never seen from a Drathari leader. Honest reflection. He read the summit transcript from day 11. He listened to the audio recording of his own words. The dismissal, the laughter, the primate's comment. And I watched his face change as he heard, for the first time, what those words sounded like from the other side. I did not know they had given us the relay technology for free, he said on the second day, reviewing the audit data. I assumed it was a trade agreement. It was a gift, I said. Most of what they gave us was a gift. He was quiet after that. The formal ceremony took place on day 240, broadcast live to every world in the council, and, through a special arrangement that Claire Morgan negotiated, to every human colony world as well. The assembly chamber on Orith Prime was full for the first time since the walkout. Every delegate present, every seat occupied, every screen active. Torhan stood at the central podium. He was in full ceremonial dress, which in Drathari culture is reserved for the most significant moments in a leader's life. His hands were steady, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the tight control of a man doing something that every fiber of his cultural conditioning told him was unthinkable. He spoke for 11 minutes. He read from the summit transcript. He quoted his own words back to the chamber and acknowledged, publicly and without qualification, that they were wrong. He named the human contributions, all of them, reading through the audit list while the assembly sat in stunned silence. He apologized not just for the insult of day 11, but for the 22 years of institutional disrespect that had preceded it. And then he said something that was not in the script. Something he added himself, in the moment, looking directly into the camera that was broadcasting to human worlds. I called your people a species that had not earned its place among the stars. I was wrong. You earned your place the day you arrived. You earned it every day after. And we were too proud, too comfortable, and too blind to see it. I do not ask your forgiveness because I have not yet earned it. I ask only for the chance to try. The chamber was silent when he finished, not the awkward silence of embarrassment or the hostile silence of disagreement. The respectful silence of people witnessing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Claire Morgan delivered humanity's response 3 days later. She stood in a government building on Earth, surrounded by the elected leaders who had managed the withdrawal, and addressed the council through the same broadcast system. She accepted the apology. She confirmed humanity's willingness to rejoin the council under the agreed terms: full membership, retroactive colonial rights, and a structural reform of the voting system to prevent any single bloc from marginalizing a member species again. This last condition was new, added during the final negotiations, and it passed unanimously because no one was in a position to argue against it. The formal re-entry ceremony happened 1 week later. The human delegation returned to Orith Prime on a single diplomatic vessel. Claire Morgan walked into the assembly chamber for the first time in 251 days. She was greeted not with laughter, but with a standing acknowledgement from every delegate in the room. I met her afterward, in a small reception room off the main chamber. She looked different from the last time I had seen her in person. Not older exactly, but more settled, like someone who had passed through something difficult and come out the other side knowing exactly who she was. You did not have to come back, I told her. She smiled. It was a small, tired smile, but it was real. No, she agreed. We did not. Then why? She looked out the window at the stars, the same stars I had stared at on so many sleepless nights, wondering if the galaxy I had dedicated my life to serving was going to survive its own arrogance. Because giving up on people is easy, she said, and humans are not very good at easy. We tried, actually. After the referendum, there was a real movement to just walk away completely, build our own networks, our own alliances, our own future. And we could have. We were already doing it. In another year, we would have been completely independent. What changed? Nothing changed, she said. That was the point. The outer verge was still burning. The Movarathi were still hungry. People were still dying because the relays were down and ships could not navigate safely. And our people, the same people who voted 81% to leave, they started sending messages to our government, not demanding that we go back to the council, just asking, quietly, whether there was something we could do about the people who were suffering. She turned from the window and looked at me. That is what humans are, Valith. We are the species that watches other people suffer and cannot look away, even when those people laughed at us, even when they told us we did not belong. We cannot look at a starving colony and say that is not our problem. We cannot watch ships crash because we pulled the navigation data and not feel responsible. We cannot hear about a war that we used to prevent and pretend it has nothing to do with us. She shook her head slightly. It is our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. We care too much, about everything, about everyone, even people who have given us every reason to stop caring. I did not trust myself to speak for a moment. When I did, my voice was unsteady. The galaxy does not deserve that kind of loyalty. No, Claire agreed, it does not. But deserving has never been the point. If we only helped people who deserved it, we would never help anyone, including ourselves. She straightened up and extended her hand, a human gesture I had learned, signifying agreement and respect. I took it. Her grip was warm and firm, the grip of someone who had chosen to forgive something that did not have to be forgiven. I returned to my quarters that night and sat at my terminal for the last time as acting chair. The infrastructure database was already updating. Human relay stations were coming back online, one by one, small blue indicators appearing on the network map like stars emerging from behind clouds. The first cryo-enzyme shipments had been dispatched from Earth. A human peacekeeping flotilla was en route to the outer verge. The galaxy was healing, not because the old systems were being restored, but because the people who had built those systems were choosing, deliberately and without obligation, to rebuild what they had every right to let crumble. I thought about what Claire had said. We care too much, about everything, about everyone. And I realized that this was the thing the Galactic Council had never understood about humanity. Not their technology, not their generosity, not their stubborn refusal to be diminished. The thing that made humans extraordinary was simpler and more profound than any of that. They could have let us collapse. They had every right, every reason, every justification that any rational species could have asked for. The galaxy had mocked them, excluded them, laughed at their request for basic equality, and then demanded that they continue providing the services that held everything together. No civilization in the history of the Council had been treated so badly and asked to give so much. And they came back anyway. Not because they needed us. We had made it abundantly clear that we needed them far more than they needed us. Not because they feared the consequences of staying away. They had already proven they could survive and thrive on their own. Not because they had no other choice. They had every choice, and the easiest one was to keep walking. They came back because, despite everything, they still believed the galaxy was worth saving, even after we had given them every reason to believe otherwise, even after we had treated their kindness as weakness and their generosity as obligation, even after we had laughed at them in a room full of their peers. They forgave us, not because we earned it, because they chose to, because forgiving was who they were, and no amount of cruelty or neglect could change that fundamental truth about what it meant to be human. That is what makes them extraordinary. Not their weapons, not their technology, not their relays or their medicine or their navigation algorithms. Their stubborn, irrational, magnificent refusal to give up on people who gave up on them. I closed the database and watched the blue lights multiply across the network map. Each one was a relay station waking up. Each one was a choice. Each one was a small act of grace from a species that owed us nothing and gave us everything. The galaxy did not deserve humanity, but humanity believed we could become something that did. And maybe, just maybe, they were right.